Welcome, everyone. Today's event is an international interdisciplinary World Café focused on climate change scholarship with a particular focus on climate justice. Climate justice is a framework and an approach. It's a perspective and it's a vision. Like our international and interdisciplinary panel today, a climate justice perspective invites us to widen our scholarly scope, to traverse borders, and transcend traditional boundaries, especially those that exist between disciplinary perspectives, between research and action, and between climate science and social justice. Today's World Café will take place in 3 parts. First, panelists will briefly introduce themselves and their journeys into climate change scholarship. Next, we'll host a panel discussion anchored by several key questions to be addressed by select panelists and then commented upon by the wider panel. And lastly, there will be an opportunity for audience Q&A, which Catriona Carter and I will moderate. And because we're saving Q&A for the end, please feel free to enter your questions into the chat as we go along, and Catriona and I will be keeping an eye on that. So we'll hear from each of our panelists. I'd like to offer introductions for each co-moderator today, myself and Catriona. First, Catriona Carter is a senior political scientist working at the Research Center, Environment, Territories in Transition, Infrastructure and Society at INRAE, France. A longtime specialist in public policy analysis, she currently focuses on the transformation of decision-making to address climate change impacts in connection with biodiversity loss. Indeed, it is this focus on political transformation which brings her into the field of climate justice. And lastly, my name is Carly Trott. I'm an associate professor in psychology at the University of Cincinnati. My climate justice research aims to bring visibility to and work against the inequitable impacts of climate change socially and geographically. My work draws upon theories within and beyond psychology, including social movement theories and socio-ecological systems frameworks, and often employs community-engaged, participatory, and action-oriented research methods. Importantly, my research aims to center the voices and experiences of those most affected by climate change and environmental injustice. And much of my work involves partnering across disciplines and internationally. So I'm thrilled to be co-facilitating this event today with Catriona and our fantastic panel of scholars. So with that, I want to hand it over to Catriona to invite introductions.
Thank you, Carly. So as you can see, we have a wonderful panel of international scholars with us in the World Café today. And their work deals with climate change and climate justice from a variety of different disciplinary angles and who are at different stages of their career. So to begin with, I'd like to invite each of our panelists to say a few words about their work they do, their disciplinary perspective that they bring to their research, and how they became interested in climate change research in the first place. Let's start with Didier. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Okay, thank you, Katie. Hi, everyone. So I'm Didier Svengado. So I'm a French researcher working at National Center for Scientific Research, so CNRS in French. So my main expertise is climate dynamics. So I'm a physicist by training, and I've been involved in IPCC last cycle. I was a lead author of the special report on the ocean and the cryosphere, published in 2019, and I also was contributing author to the following ones. So what I can say is, very early, I was very interested into climate dynamics, and very early, also in the beginning of the 2000s, I realized that it might become a crucial issue, and it is nowadays, very clear. Also, what I can say is that I'm working in a network at University of Bordeaux named Tackling Global Change. So we are very motivated, and this network is by essence pluridisciplinary. So we are really trying to bring together scientists from physician, natural science, and social science together to really try to make progress into environmental questions. And I'm also part of an EU project named TPSM, which is about tipping points. And I think it's also quite relevant here, since tipping points can be found in the physical system, but also in the social system. Thank you. I'm very glad to be here and very excited by the discussion.
Thank you very much, Didier. Kate Nicole?
Yes, well, thank you very much, and hi, everyone. My name is Kate Nicole Hoffman. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Public Engagement with Science at UC. My PhD is in philosophy, and my research program is centered around understanding and reimagining the relationship between humans and the rest of nature. So my dissertation focused on what actually counts as nature and natural in a modern world, and then how this affects, what we strive to protect and the kinds of interventions that we deem to be acceptable. I've also written on nature-based solutions and climate adaptation, and I have a somewhat quirky project on exploring our relationships with animals through the lens of mental health. So I've been lucky enough to be able to put some of these ideas into practice in community-oriented and policy spaces, and that work has tended to center around helping finding ways to help people explore their relationships with the local environments around them, and also to grapple with the fact that, given climate change, these environments are changing. So for me, the issue of climate change and climate justice is not just scientific or philosophical, or political, but it's deeply identity-based and personal kind of for every individual. So one of my main research projects is exploring the ways in which the arts might be used as a means of connecting people in new or deeper ways with the world around them, and doing so in a way that really respects and elevates the experience and the expertise of the people participating. So, I've done kind of projects on this theme in places like the Galapagos Islands, and most recently starting a project with collaborators in Burundi, Uganda, but also in places closer to home like Cincinnati and like Philadelphia, places you don't maybe immediately associate with nature, but where there are changing environments and relationships. And I think those need to be kind of uncovered and discussed. So just really, really quickly, I know I'm almost out of time, just how I got working on climate change related issues. I think as soon as you start thinking critically about the relationship between humans and the rest of nature, right, climate change it's impossible for it not to take center stage. And it just represents this real disruption in these localized relationships, and not just relationships between humans and animals and plants and landscapes, but also humans with other humans. So my interest as a philosopher and an artist, and in my capacity as a postdoc here, is in exploring those relationships, thinking about ways in which we might be able to do better. Thanks. Also very, very happy to be here.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to Delaney. Would you like to say some words to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Delaney Harness. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Communication, Film, and Media Studies here at University of Cincinnati. My work looks at interorganizational networks, particularly around issues of sustainability and human rights, where I'm particularly interested in how transparency or its strategic absence often shapes the actions of corporate actors, NGOs, and governments in kind of tackling urgent environmental challenges. My research has really engaged with global frameworks like the United Nations Global Compact for the last 5 or 6 years. I'm also part of a network called the Mr. Environmental Communication Program based out of SLU in Sweden, which is sponsored by the Swedish Center for Environmental Research, where we are looking at kind of how we think about decision making in environmental issues, how we think about community engagement with environmental issues, and a whole host of other things. And so I'm really interested in exploring how market-based actors contribute to equitable or more likely inequitable environmental practices. In terms of what inspired me to get into climate change work, I initially was a scholar who was looking at visibility around human rights issues. And for me, the intersection of human rights and climate just became too staggeringly clear as soon as I started my research, especially when you think about things like Indigenous rights and kind of a whole host of like health inequities that are being caused by climate. And so it became really important that the work I do prioritizes policy and action around sustainability and human rights issues. So I'm excited to talk about that today.
Thank you very much, Delaney. Vanessa?
Hi, everyone. My PhD is in statistics, and I was recruited in 2010 at INRAE in the same research unit as Katerina, working with Didier in the group tackling global change. As soon as I arrived at INRAE, thanks to a collaboration with an environmental economist, the question of measuring well-being in relation to climate change quickly emerged. My disciplinary background has led me and continues to lead me to the development of innovative statistical methods to assess human well-being in its multidimensionality. This requires revealing both the heterogeneity among individuals and space and tracking the determinants. The first work I conducted was the design of well-being indicators for municipalities in Southwest France. The aim was to gain a greater understanding of the complex question of social vulnerability in relation to global change. Today, I'm focusing on the connection between well-being and environmentally responsible behavior to understand the interactions that take place at the level of the individuals in their daily life. That is to say, the opportunities or constraints for acting in favor of the environment in relation to their living conditions, and also the impacts felt in terms of well-being. Within this framework, I'm currently leading a research project on the potential of nature-based solutions as a pathway to transformative change. The objective is to unravel residents' perception of the services and potential disservices provided by nature-based solutions and link them with their perceived well-being to reveal preferences and trade-offs at the individual level. And the challenge is to provide insights for public decision-making in the search for long-term solutions for ecological transition, which means attaining sustainability while maintaining human well-being. And I'm happy to be here with you.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. And finally, we come to Tolu. Perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you, Katrina. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here. My name is Tolu Lokwe Odunla. I am Nigerian, but I'm schooling right now at the University of Cincinnati. I'm a PhD candidate in environmental engineering, and my specific focus is water systems analysis. And my journey to climate change was actually the journey to graduate school. My first degree was in civil engineering, and I became very interested in water and environment. So I wanted to specialize as an environmental engineer. And then I came to grad school at UC, and my professor, Dr. Patrick Ray, happened to be in climate research. And he does a lot with decision making under climate uncertainty, how to plan for our water systems under climate change, how to make strong and robust investment decisions under climate change. And so that's how I got into the climate change field. And I will say that my research is a mix of a whole lot of things right now. So it's interesting to actually describe what I do, but I'm primarily an environmental engineer who focuses on planning water systems under climate uncertainty. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. So, with Carly, given the richness and diversity of the scholars on the panel, we thought we would start off by talking about interdisciplinarity. Many scholars, both early and established, are becoming interested in climate change and from a variety of disciplines. And many climate scientists recognize the necessity to have a deeper understanding of climate change challenges, working with other sciences, other natural sciences, social sciences, humanities. So that leads us to our first question. What are the challenges of doing interdisciplinary work? And what advice would you give to early career scholars interested in working on interdisciplinary climate projects? Kate Nicole, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Yeah, well, so, in terms of, I guess, my own interdisciplinarity, as I mentioned in my intro, here I'm working for a center where it's kind of mostly focused on the sciences, but I'm coming from a PhD in the humanities and philosophy, and I'm, using the arts as a key methodology in my work. And then in terms of the collaborations I've been lucky enough to be a part of, I've worked with policymakers and diplomats, but farmers and guides and a poet one time. So I guess the first thing to say is just, I think that all of these varied perspectives are really essential. Climate change is all encompassing. And so I think that we kind of need all hands on deck. But I think one of the biggest challenges is communication just across disciplines and across expertise. So, scientists often get a bad rep about using lingo and being really hard to understand. But honestly, I think that we in the humanities are equally to blame. I'd say that in general, we are not great about communicating what we know in a way that's clear and also seems relevant to someone outside of our small communities. So it's not really a surprise. Often academics are not incentivized to, communicate outside of our small circles. But I think that communication is so essential if we're trying to put the pieces together in a way that, help us to make collective progress on this kind of issue.
Paradox is that our insecurity will get us into these kind of relationships.
I don't know if.
But
Okay.
Anyway.
All good.
Never mind. Let's keep.
Anyway,
if you can refine your train of thought, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's good.
Yeah.
So in terms of effective communication, I mean, I think there are strategies for more effectively communicating across disciplines and expertise. This is something we think a lot about at the Center for Public Engagement with Science. And I also think that the arts have a way of really breaking down disciplinary barriers as well. But for me, I guess I found that one of the best paths to effective communication is effective relationship building. So, when I'm talking to you as a genuine partner and I'm not just trying to impress you with my fancy words and my fancy knowledge, then, the communication changes and real kind of collaboration can begin. In terms of my advice to other early career scholars, I just think, there's obviously so much work to be done. And I really think that all disciplines, all areas of expertise can contribute something to climate scholarship in one way or another. So I guess my advice would be to find your piece of the puzzle. My initial picture of what it means to be engaged in climate change scholarship was not doing a theater project in the Galapagos where, we're helping kids take stories of environmental importance and turn them into their own plays. That's probably no one's initial picture of climate change scholarship, but it's my small piece of the puzzle based on the skills and the interests and the opportunities that I've had. So I guess my advice would be, to find your own piece and don't let disciplinary barriers stop you, which might mean having to break some norms. And I know that's not always possible for everyone in every circumstance, but it just seems to me like in general, passionate involvement based on what you can bring to the table is more important than trying to fit into a particular box. So
thank you.
That's from me.
Thank you very much. And Vanessa, from your perspective as statistician,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So working with other disciplines is something I had already started during my PhD. In fact, it's quite common for statistics, which has a wide range of applications and always interacts with another discipline. My research unit today combines theories and concepts from economics, sociology, geography, agronomy, political science, mathematics to investigate socio-ecological transition. And today, personally, to analyze environmental concern and nature-based solutions, I collaborate with an environmental economist and a researcher in ecology and biodiversity conservation. And I also interact with researchers in sociology and political science. Concerning climate change, interdisciplinarity seems to be the miracle solution to approach the complexity of its effects on society. But I would say it does not only have positive sides. To take a mathematical illustration, 1 + 1 makes a 3, a significant added value, but something new and innovative. So you need to be aware that academic recognition is sometimes more difficult. For example, for some work published either in interdisciplinary or in thematic journals. So in terms of advice, I would say that you really need to enjoy interacting with other disciplines. It requires a certain open-mindedness and curiosity. It's a daily challenge to understand each other, but it's also exciting. For example, I want my colleagues to understand the logic behind the statistical methods I develop, but not the mathematical details. Simplification must not be at the expense of scientific rigor, as in our research, but perhaps all the more so in interdisciplinary work, as you are sometimes the only researcher in the discipline involved in the collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in quickly? So we have some good advice, I think, finding your piece of the puzzle and being very deeply rooted in your discipline to be able to simplify but not oversimplify your research methods and approaches. Tolu, you wanted to come in at this point?
Yes, just wanted to add a little bit to what Kate Nicole said. One of the things I've learned in graduate school is also being flexible as well. So there is a way, if you're not flexible in your approach to research or in your approach to your work or discipline, then it's really hard to work on climate change problems. And the main basis of being interdisciplinary is actually the fact that everyone has enough flexibility to actually see from another person's perspective, enough patience as well. And like I said, even though I work with water infrastructure, I've had to work with economists as well, maybe some sociologists as well. And so there is always that point where as an engineer, you still have to try to think like an economist. You still have to have the perspective of a sociologist. So I would say that flexibility would be one key advice I have for early career researchers. Then also I probably would say just the willingness to share and disseminate your research outputs, because that's where we get other people's perspective on what we do, which can actually help us in finding that piece of the puzzle that we can contribute. Yeah, thank you.
And Didier, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in if there is time left. Just to say that I think disciplinarity is really key from a scholar point of view, but just from a life point of view. And as I'm saying to my kids, you should not choose your discipline. You should be good everywhere, and it's not just. It's also because the real world is interdisciplinary by essence, and and when I was a kid, I was really liking much of the disciplines, also depending a bit on the teacher, but generally speaking, I thought that every discipline was quite interesting. And what I lacked quite a lot is also the concept of honest coming from the age of enlightenment, where France was quite active. So maybe that's a French tradition. But I really think that that's very important and very useful to learn a lot of different disciplines to pick. And it's also very relevant for climate change because, of course, it's touching so many different things that you need to have a pluridisciplinary approach.
Thank you, Didier. I'm going to move us on to our second major question for today. So moving on from interdisciplinarity, we want to talk about the international dimensions. So climate change is a global challenge, and many aspects of climate justice consider inequities in contributions to greenhouse gas emissions, the impacts of climate change, and inequities in access to decision-making and policy responses in a variety of places around the world. So for panelists doing international work, and especially from a climate justice perspective, what is important to keep in mind when doing this work? And we'll go to Delaney.
So I think one of the most critical things to keep in mind when doing international work is really addressing these deeper inequities that are embedded in global frameworks, while being attentive to things like local context, power dynamics. I think that climate justice is not only about reducing emissions, but it's also about ensuring that the burdens, the benefits, and the decision-making processes are really distributed equitably, especially for communities that are most impacted by climate change, which, quite frankly, is not the global north. I think one of the clear examples from my work is around sustainability development goals, where I've studied how global reporting practices often reflect those inequities. Denmark, for instance, has actually reframed these SDGs to align with their own national context, emphasizing areas like sustainable consumption, or they're doing work around poverty in a very different way than we're seeing in other places like the global south. And they're doing this because they've already achieved the original targets of the Sustainability Development Goals. So where do they go from here? And I think that while this is an admirable approach, for example, for advancing sustainability at home, it also highlights one of the key challenges, which is that global frameworks like the SDGs, sometimes even the IPCC, is there an extra C? I don't know. Which kind of assume this like one size fits all approach that doesn't really account for these vastly different starting points and priorities of different countries. I think, for example, in my own work with the UN Global Compact, where I've examined issues around environmental and social governance frameworks, we often see them prioritizing metrics that are palatable to global markets, but that often overlook the needs and voices of marginalized communities that are most affected by climate change. If I look at carbon markets, for instance, these are often framed as a global solution, but the benefits and burdens are really unevenly distributed. So a carbon offset project in the global south might reduce emissions on paper while displacing local communities or undermining their rights to land and resources. And my research wants to critically analyze how these systems are communicated and negotiated, calling attention to whose voices actually are included or excluded in these processes. I think with my work with Mistra on sustainability reporting, we can also see the hierarchy of the focus in global reporting practices. So organizations often highlight their achievements to align with their branding, while they often ignore the less marketable but equally critical issues, such as access to clean water or resilience for actually climate vulnerable communities. And so I think what's most important when it comes to ensuring international efforts is that we don't impose this kind of top-down solution or mentality, but instead that we really create spaces where local voices are centered, where historical and structural inequities are also acknowledged, and that collaboration prioritizes co-creation with these communities, right? That it's interdisciplinary, not just in the disciplines that are relevant to the project, but it's actually interdisciplinary in the sense that you're bringing the community into the work. And I think that doing this ensures that the knowledge and needs shape the policies and the actions that are affecting those communities. And that's how you get genuine climate justice.
Thanks so much, Delaney. I think we might have time for one comment from another panelist, if anybody wants to chime in. And if not, we can move on to question number 3. Catriona, do you want to introduce the next question? I want to get back into this idea of community engagement, maybe during the Q&A afterwards.
Sure. So let's keep the discussion on the question of climate justice for the minute. And as just been said, climate change affects everyone. I mean, there's a sort of generalized vulnerability, globalized vulnerability, in that we can all be at any one moment victims of climate change events, forest fires, flash flooding. But as has been expressed, its impacts are unevenly distributed between social groups, territories. And for this reason, it is commonly described as a threat multiplier, in that it exacerbates pre-existing inequalities. So the next questions really are, what kinds of inequalities do you deal with in your work? And what does a climate justice perspective bring to your work? And Tolu is going to launch the discussion on this one.
Thank you, Catriona. This is a very interesting question, and I feel it's just like a follow-up to what Delaney just answered. So again, like I said, I'm in water systems engineering, and we focus mostly on how to build resilience, robustness into our projects under changing climate. And I think you've described climate change accurately when it comes to our discipline, in the sense that climate change is indeed a threat multiplier. And so I'll give just a typical example. So we might all be familiar with the water cycle, or at least we see that rain comes down, snow comes down, we see that evaporation happens, the clouds gather, it comes back again. So there is this way water is being recycled over the earth, it just keeps coming around. But under climate change, the challenge is we are having maybe more intense evaporation in some areas. So water is drying up some areas quicker than you could imagine. And in some areas as well, we have ice caps that are actually melting faster than we ever imagined they would. And so we now have two extremities, in the sense that some areas are getting drier and drier, some areas are getting wetter and wetter. But the challenge now is the water is not where we need it to be. So some areas might be getting wetter and wetter, but that's not where we need the water. So under climate change, apart from the fact that we are struggling to understand and plan our water resources, we also have the challenge of an inequitable distribution, first of all, even naturally, just because of how climate change impacts the weather patterns and all. So that definitely is one thing we face in our discipline of planning water resources. And so now we have to think not just about maybe building a dam, not just about building an irrigation network. We have to think about how to operate it equitably under climate change. And in terms of what the climate justice perspective brings into our discipline, I'll just give a brief 3-point rundown of what I learned and what I am bringing into my research. I learned that equity needs to be viewed from three perspectives, and this is from environmental justice literature. So we have to think about equity or injustice, or justice rather, in terms of recognitional, so that you are actually trying to recognize where inequities may occur. And we have to think about it in terms of procedural, meaning actually your planning, your procedures, how you plan for it. And then you have to think about this in terms of distributional, who gets what. And when we think about climate justice or anything justice, we just think about, oh, yes, how do we share? But there won't be an accurate sharing and equitable sharing without a proper recognition of where the inequities may be, and then a procedural, having a process, a methodology of actually sharing these things out or mapping things out. And I think that's where what Delaney said also comes up in terms of recognitional equity. That's where you bring all the stakeholders to the table. So the question we do have to ask ourselves as we plan our water resources in my discipline is, are the true stakeholders actually invited to the table? So if I am actually building a dam, maybe somewhere in Africa, maybe I am a consultant here in the US, am I inviting those who will use the dam to the table? Am I speaking to them? Am I actually talking to them about what they face, how climate change actually plays out in their day-to-day living? That's what will help me be a better planner of their resources. Now, as I also build my models and I try to engineer everything, am I using something that is available and accessible to them as well? Or am I actually focusing on methodologies that I only can operate? So that's how we think about these things. And if I am able to properly recognize inequities, if I'm able to adequately bring it into my modeling and my planning, then most likely I will be more equitable in how I distribute my water resources. So I would like to take a pause there. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tolu. Does anyone else want to jump in onto these general themes of distribution, inequity? Who's invited to the table? Vanessa, yes.
Yeah, maybe I can say a few words on the well-being approach I developed. It may help grasping these impacts as it situates the individual in their living environment, both on material aspects and the social aspects. I don't have an entry that aims to measure inequalities, but the assessment of well-being reveals obviously some disparities, whether among individuals or between territories. And these differences, and because of these differences, people may be more or less exposed to climate change. One solution may be environmental responsible behavior, but we have evidenced through the lens of individuals' perceived living conditions that the adoption of pro-environmental behavior is constrained by the daily room for maneuver available to individuals. Each individual cannot intervene in the same way. And finally, for instance, nature-based solutions are used for climate change. And we are actually studying if the concerned populations are already rather advantaged or disadvantaged in terms of living conditions, and if these solutions may impact their well-being. And by tracking the ways in which individuals welcome and contribute to the emergence of these solutions and maintenance of these solutions, this may reveal contrasted levels and obstacles among individuals.
Thank you.
Excellent. With that, I want to transition into our final main question for today. And that has to do with the role of scholars and scientists in public life. And so, given the urgency of climate challenges, a lively debate in academic circles and in the public sphere as well is unfolding around the role of scientists in public and civic life, particularly around political advocacy and activism. So we're going to go to Didier on this one. What, in your view, should we as scholars be doing to raise awareness and to be moving the needle on climate action and policymaking?
Thank you, Carly. Yeah, this is a difficult question, I think, and I can talk about my experience as a starter, as a leader of an association named Acclimatera. So that's an association that is trying to bring together scholars and decision makers at the scale of the French region named Nouvelle-Aquitaine, which is southwest of France. And from this perspective, what I can say is that raising awareness is difficult for sure. We are talking about climate change for decades now, and changes are evolving quite slowly. But also, what I can say is that this is evolving, and I can see that from my lifetime. And sometimes I hear some youngsters saying nothing is changing, and I should say this isn't true. Because when I started as a PhD student, the awareness was really far lower. And I've seen a rise about the concern about climate change, and it's now occupying quite a huge space in the public debate, at least in Europe. And I can see that it's sometimes used within the political arena, even as an authoritative argument, which I not always really like. What I can say in terms of perspective is that my feeling is that at the very moment we are facing a big danger concerning our democracies, and this danger is division. The fact that people are not talking together that much, or there is really some huge gaps between different people, and the election of Donald Trump, as you know, is really a vivid sign of such divisions. And these divisions are also between big cities and the suburbs and countryside, most notably. And we also experience them in France and even at the scale of our region. So that's where, from my perspective, but of course, we will discuss it maybe if we have time. I think we should be very careful that activism is not feeding this division. And I think it is the case in France, for instance, when people are putting some tomato juice over paintings. I'm not sure that's an act that is understood by a wide audience. And I think that from my discussion, I think for a wide number of people, this is just demonstrating, in their mind at least, the belief of how crazy such ecological movements are. And this is comforting a number of people in the belief that a political ecology is made by urbans that have no idea of what nature is, and that are just coming out of the blue without any proper expertise. And so I think we need, of course, to fight against this view, but for this purpose, I think we need to be very careful with the actions we are leading. In my view, public demonstration in the street are really making sense, while there might be other, let's call them modern action, that can be counterproductive and widen further the gaps between people. And I think that what we need to do is to mind this gap and find a way to reconcile ourselves together. And this is maybe the main challenge to have any chance of success for transformation of our society towards carbon-free activity, is to find a way to reconcile together, and we need to think about action that can make this reconciliation possible. I'm very interested into other perspective on this, and how to push also on ideas on how to push action as a scholar, and avoiding to further dig into division.
Thanks so much, Didier. Do we have other panelists that would like to speak to that question? Delaney.
So I tend to disagree. I can very much appreciate that we are in a period of division. I think here in the United States, for example, we have seen that the idea of expertise is being attacked in and of itself, right? People who are experts in fields are being disregarded. And I think that as much as I'm also not a fan of people throwing tomato soup on paintings, what they are doing is in and of itself trying to make climate justice issues hyper visible, right? By engaging in these sorts of kind of pageantry or showmanship actions, they are bringing climate change back into discussion, even if they're just having to report that somebody poured soup on art in a museum on the news. And I think that it's these kinds of radical acts that if you're in social movement studies, we call them radical flanks, right? These radical flanks are intended to essentially bring the movements back into alignment with what their true intended purpose was. And so I think that it's really important right now that scholars and scientists are actively talking to activists and being part of movements like Extinction Rebellion to show and prioritize these issues on a global stage. I mean, we are at a point of crisis where within the next 10 years, we are going to fall off a cliff. And it's going to be the millennial generation and Gen Z and Gen Alpha who are left with whatever there is in the world.
Thank you, Delaney. Other panelists, comments? I'll just quickly chime in and say that I do research with youth climate justice activists, and within the movement, there is sometimes disagreement about tactics, but each of the groups of youth and around the world have done an excellent job, I think, of raising awareness and putting this center stage and pushing the conversation forward. And when it comes to scientists and scholars and our role in public life, I think we have to recognize that, climate change activism is facing repression, and that repression is currently ramping up. And so when we think about our role in the world, and as the privilege that scholars and scientists hold, speaking out can be a really important way to raise our voice and to talk about, pushing policy and what needs to be done. Any other comments? I just want to invite everybody here too. If you had questions, if you had comments, feel free to put them in the chat. So we've made it to our final portion today. Maybe we got a question. Brooke says, "Thank you, Brooke. I like the conversation and the variety of perspectives." We're going to move into our final Q&A portion. Thank you all panelists for sharing your views on these important topics. If anyone has questions, you can raise your hand, and Catriona and I will monitor and call on people. But just to get us started, I want to just throw a question out to the panel members about this question that's often asked about how to communicate about the enormity of climate change challenges without overwhelming your audience. Do you have thoughts about how to communicate about this?
I think Kate Nicole has, would you want to comment on this? I think, yeah.
Sure. Yeah, it's a huge question, but an initial thought is, I think as much as possible, keeping things localized. I mean, there's a way, climate change is a huge global problem, obviously, and it affects different areas differently, and some areas a lot more than others. But I think sometimes starting with kind of changes that people can maybe even observe and are sort of part of more locally is one way to at least take a step, especially when you're talking with people who are really skeptical and they're like, well, I can't, you know, I can't see it. I don't know how it affects me. So sort of starting in these more localized ways and then, you know, using that as an opportunity to think more globally about the issue is maybe one in into the issue.
Yeah, thank you. And I just might share a little on my own experience on that. And when we train people when thinking about how to transform decision making in relation to climate change challenges, when you start off the training discussing all the challenges, and you can see people becoming slowly overwhelmed. And what we've learned is the trick of moving quite quickly to what can you do? What can you do to change? What action can you take today, tomorrow, which would help move in a different direction?
And I'll follow up that as well with some of the psychology research that's out there. So for the longest time, you know, in my field, people were concerned with how do we get people to care about this? How do we make sure that this is on people's radar, that it becomes a priority? And what the evidence shows is that people do care. Around the world, this is on people's radar. It's among their priorities. Public opinion polls globally and within countries show that this is something that people are concerned about. So what we have to do now, I think we need to move on to the next part, which is that people don't often know how to act. They don't necessarily have a sense of agency for what they can do. And so that's the next challenge, and certainly related to the mental health conversation that's happening now. People are in distress. There's a lot of anxiety and worry associated with this. What do we do to set people up to feel like they can get involved and be a part of making a difference? So with that, I want to share a question from the chat, and any panelist can respond to this. So actually, let me scroll up. I saw an earlier one. So regarding the tomato soup on the paintings conversation, what are panelists' opinions about the argument that many people are more enraged about the defacing of art rather than the destruction of the planet? Oh yeah, Delaney, go ahead.
I actually was going to say, I think Didier has had his hand raised for a minute, and I did want to give him a chance to speak on this if he wanted to start.
Thank you. Yeah, so I raised my hand for more questions, so sorry, but I don't know, but I can speak quickly and then I let you answer to this specific question, but I'm not really have a clear opinion. Just what I wanted to add is about this idea of what can we say to people to get better engaged, and from my experience, from my perspective, I think what we should avoid is just be alarmist, just say, oh, and as an IPCC author, that's what we can do by just raising all the consequences, which are very worrying. And from time to time, after a conference, I can feel that people are really concerned, but also a bit depressed. And I'm always ending my conference by saying it's not over, it's not too late, and that we need to act now, but we need to be really decided. And just to finish, what I also saying is that we need to provide to say that changing is not just an effort, because usually we are pushing the feeling that okay, you need to change your habits. You will have to make an effort. While in fact, what we need to try to convey now is that changing our way of life is not necessarily bad. It can be better for our well-being. I mean, going in holidays to a place pretty close to where we are, but in fact we do not really know, it can be as exciting as going to very far away. Yeah, is what I wanted to. Yeah, thank you.
There's another question in the chat. So this is for everyone, if you have thoughts. Despite some scholars being disregarded in their fields of research, Do you think scholars should take non-traditional routes to draw people's attention to their work, especially at a time where political leaders may be actively working against your research? Delaney.
Yeah, so I think this is where I can actually answer kind of both of these questions in one, perhaps. So to the soup can question, I would say, look, if people are upset about the defacement of art, climate change poses a significant risk to art conservation, right? Whether it's temperature and humidity fluctuations, extreme weather events where we literally are going to see the art destroyed because of floods and storms and wildfires. So to that point, is it a radical thing that these people are doing? Yes. But if you don't draw attention to what the potential risks are for climate change, we're not going to have art in 10 to 20 years. In terms of whether or not I think we should take non-traditional routes, I think you take every route possible right now. I think you continue to have conversations with governments and with local communities. I think you talk to everyone, right? You talk to people even when it doesn't feel like it's working, because at some point it does. As a communication scholar, I would say you have to build networks in strange ways and with strange bedfellows. And that often means that you have to take non-traditional ways of being seen in order to get your foot in the door and have a voice at the table.
And I'll just add too that there's a way of blending scholarship with doing some non-traditional things. For example, one way I often talk about my own work is that I'm impatient for social change. And so I figure out how to partner with organizations and groups and communities to do the change work as part of the research process. Now I'm in the social sciences, so studying those change processes and how people are working together or what the impacts are is something that it comes very naturally in my field. But I think thinking about interdisciplinary, international, partnerships where people are trying new things or initiatives, and keeping track of what those impacts are is one way to think about a non-traditional approach to research that involves climate action and trying to advance climate justice, especially when we talk about that community engagement piece. Keeping an eye on the time, and I just want to get to the last question that I see in the chat for today. So this has to do with education. So anybody whose work touches education in some way, this is for you. Victoria says, thanks for putting this panel together. The North American Association for Environmental Education released guidelines for educating for climate action and justice. Would panelists talk about if or how they interface with the public education sector? Didier.
Yeah, I'm talking a lot. So if anybody else want to answer, but just to say that, yeah, of course, that's very important. And personally, I'm going to schools quite regularly to try to improve the knowledge of our children, and also to discuss with them and try to avoid authoritative statement, but just to try to provide the dialogue. I really want to argue that that's what we need, and I really dread that having too radical statements, too strong views will really not help our view.
I don't know if just to say one other thing about what I've really enjoyed working with kids in the different ways that I have is that they tend to have such wild imaginations and not those sort of clamps on the imagination that a lot of us have now as we've gotten a bit older. And I think that imagination and hope for the future about what things could be like is such an incredible resource, actually, as we try to think about a better climate future. So besides just educating them about climate change, really bringing them on board to help us imagine what our future, their future is going to be, could be an exciting thing.
Absolutely. Well, thanks everybody. I've got my eye on the time and we are at the hour mark right now. So I just want to wrap us up by again thanking all of our attendees for being here today, and also thanking everyone who helped to make this event possible. Again, first, my co-moderator, Catriona Carter from INRAE in Bordeaux, France, for helping to organize today's World Café. Next, thanks to UC's Center for Public Engagement with Science for helping to support this event, and a huge thanks to UC International for setting this event into motion. And last but not least, of course, I just want to thank today's panelists in Cincinnati and in Bordeaux. We discussed some enormously complex topics today, and I'm sure that we only scratched the surface. If we had more time, we'd be able to dig deeper, but I'm so grateful for your insights on these important topics today. So thanks again, everyone, for spending part of your Friday with us. And we'll be sharing this event through recording later on. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Carly, and thank you, everybody.